So welcome to our first This Week in Geometry segment for the end of the year in Math 6. And the first thing that we're going to talk about this week in geometry is angles. The most basic, probably one of the first things you learn about geometry after you talk about the shapes, the squares, triangles, circles, etc. And so let's go through some of the vocabulary that we need to talk about angles. Now, there are four basic things that we talk about when we start geometry, when we start talking about things like angles in geometry. And it starts with this thing called a point. And a point is exactly just that. It's this point in space. It refers to one exact location. In this case, we're going to be talking about what we call 2D space, something that has length and width, like a piece of paper. It doesn't have depth. It's not 3D. It's not like a sphere or a prism or a cube or anything like that. It's like a square, a triangle, a rectangle. Something in 2D, this is a point. It's just a place, a specific location in space. If we take that point and then we extend out in one direction, a line, forever in one direction. It's not actually a line because a line has to go in two directions, but from that point, something extending forever in one straight direction is called a ray. And if we extend that ray in both directions, it becomes known as a line. And those are the three basic units of geometry when we talk about 2D geometry. It's the point, the specific location in space, a ray which starts at one point and extends forever in one specific direction, and a line which is much like a ray except it extends forever in two different directions. What you may be less familiar with is the concept of a plane. And a plane, not like an airplane, even though it's spelled like that. A plane is just a two-dimensional space. If you imagine a plane like a piece of paper or a wall that has a length and a width, and if you could extend that forever in all directions, you would get what we call a plane. So I'm going to ask you to go ahead and write this down in a section of your notebook, specifically for the This Week in Geometry section. A point, a single specific location in space on a plane. A ray extends forever in one direction. A ray in both directions is called a line. And all of this exists on a plane, a flat surface like a piece of paper or a wall or the smartboard that extends forever in all directions. These are the basic definitions of things we need to talk about geometry, and we need to talk about angles. So go ahead, pause the video, write this down, come back when you're ready to move on. And so, like I said, this week in geometry, what we're talking about is angles. And so, much like our exploration of and our discussion of the plane, the ray, the line, and the point before, we need to go over some definitions about exactly what an angle is. And an angle is formed by two rays. As you can see, these are rays from a specific point, off in one direction, the green ray and the purple ray. And the angle is formed by two rays that share the same endpoint. That's what this is called, the endpoint of a ray, where the ray stops. In the other direction, it goes on forever, but a ray stops somewhere. Where two rays meet with the same endpoint, we have what we call an angle. And so, the angle itself is not the rays. It is actually the space between the rays. It is all this area in here that I'm about to highlight. This space is what we talk about when we talk about the angles. Now, certainly the rays are important because it is the rays, after all, that form the angle, but the angle itself is the space between the rays. And with an angle, we have special names for the parts of the angle. Obviously, the rays are just rays, but we have a name for this point here where they come together, and we call that the vertex. It's the point where the two rays of an angle intersect. So in the angle, we have the space between the rays, we have the rays themselves, and we have the vertex. And all of this together forms the angle. So if you haven't gotten a chance to pause the video and write down these three critical things here. The angle, formed by two rays that share the same endpoint. The fact that angles are actually the space between the two rays, as much as they are the rays themselves. When we talk about angles, we're talking about that space between them. And the vertex is the point where the two rays of the angle intersect. Go ahead, pause the video, write those down, come back when you're ready to move on. The last concept that we need to talk about with angles is how do we measure an angle? How do we tell how big an angle is? Well, we use these things called degrees because obviously an angle like the one we see in black is not the same as the angle that I'm drawing now in yellow. In fact, the angle is bigger. There's more space between those two rays. But it is smaller than the angle I'm now drawing in green. So angles come in different sizes, and we need a way to talk about those sizes. And the way we talk about those is with degrees. They are measured in these things called degrees. Not like the degrees that we talk about when we talk about temperature, the same vocabulary term, same spelling, different concept. So the more degrees an angle has, the larger the space between the two rays. So the ray in green that we talked about before will be measured in more degrees than the ray in black, will be measured in more degrees than the ray in yellow. Please write down the definition of degree too, or the description that's here. And we're going to go on to talking about a new way that we need to think about angles, but a new critical definition, a new critical way of thinking about angles. It is not just where two angles come together, it is actually the rotation of one ray. So take a second, just watch. You don't have to write anything down right now, but just watch. Right now at the bottom we have a ray, and I'm drawing an arrow to it in yellow. So now if we look at these two rays and we really take this ray that we started with, grab it and rotate it, we can see that as we rotate this ray, we can form an angle between the two rays. The original ray that's staying put down at the bottom and the ray that is moving right now. We can make a small angle if we only rotate the ray a little bit. We can make a large angle if we really rotate the ray. But as long as the endpoint stays the same, if we rotate the ray, we can form an angle. And that is another definition of an angle that we need to be comfortable with, an angle as a rotation of a ray. So in that case, the angles are still the space between the rays, but we also have to understand the angles as the space of that rotation. So the degrees will tell us how much that angle rotated. And so this angle rotated obviously farther than the angle in red, but not quite as far as the angle in purple. And so there are angles all over the place. We can see them in so many different things that we do. We can see them in sort of abstract art. If we probably took some screensavers from computers and put them all together, we'd have something like this. You can see angles in the colored squares, but there are also angles where squares meet. Big angles, smaller angles. So many angles in here. There are angles in sidewalks and other things that are built. This is the tile floor of a bathroom. There are also angles in structures that we build, like these beams on a bridge. And also, just for fun, if we have anybody is a skier who's watching this, when you put your skis together, if you're jumping off a mogul or something like that, or you see skiers in the X Games, then their skis make angles. So the discussion of angles, both the new definition and the old definition, is the start of this week in geometry.